Okay, so this is where we left off. We're going to start talking about casting, the casting method next. Before we kind of talked about modeling, which is a additive process. But we'll talk about casting next. So casting basically involves pouring a liquid into a mold and then allowing it to harden before removing the mold. Typically, an artist will make a work in an easily handled medium, such as clay, and then use that to create a mold. And then they use the mold to actually pour a more permanent material into that. This usually would be something like bronze. And most casting involves the substitution of one material for another, so it's a substitution process. So modeling is an additive process, and casting is a substitution process. Ancient China, Greece, Rome, and parts of Africa have used bronze casting for many years, and it's been used extensively in the West for at least the last 5 centuries, and is definitely the most common medium for memorial statues and public parks. So a lot of the metal-looking sculptures that you see are typically going to be used with bronze casting. So casting requires, several steps. First, a mold is made from the original work, usually made with a softer material such as clay or plaster. And then the process of making the mold varies, but depending on the material of the original, that can actually affect how the mold is made. Materials that will harden can be used to make a mold, so clay, concrete, liquid plastics such as fiberglass, but whatever the material, the mold completely surrounds the original piece made by the artist, leaving absolutely no gaps. And then second, the original sculpture is actually removed from the mold, and this may require the disassembly of either the mold or the original piece. And then next, the casting liquid, which is often molten bronze, is poured into the resulting hollow cavity of the mold. And finally, when the casting liquid has hardened, the mold is removed. So some casting processes use molds or flexible materials that allow many casts to be made from a single mold. So we'll talk about the lost wax process. One of these is the lost wax process. And this process is actually great for artists because they can make many pieces from one singular mold. In some other methods, the mold must be destroyed to remove the hardened cast, thus permitting only the creation of one single cast. So sometimes there's certain methods for casting where you can only make one piece from it because you have to destroy the mold in the process, but not with the lost cast process. The lost cast process, it allows you to make many pieces from the same mold. Castings can be solid or hollow depending on the casting method. The cost and weight of the material will often help to determine which casting method will be used for a specific work. The Statue of Liberty is kind of a great example. In New York Harbor, for example, it was cast in many pieces and assembled on site. And it has a really elaborate armature holding it up. So that armature, just think of an armature as something that goes inside of a 3D sculpture that helps to hold it up. So the Statue of Liberty has a quite extensive armature helping to hold it together, basically, on the inside of the sculpture. The process of casting for larger bronze statues is extremely complicated. So most artists will actually turn their original piece, done in a softer material such as clay, over to a foundry of experts who actually can make the mold and do the casting for the artist. Most of our monuments in public parks that are cast were done from clay or wax models originally, and then the foundry would make the mold and pour the bronze into the final piece. Automobile engine parts, dishes, and children's toys are among the many things manufactured that use the casting process. So let's take a look at the lost wax casting process. So here's a clay core. They use wax over the top of that. So this would be the armature, basically. They are using tools to create their sculpture made from wax. And then they create a little bit more of like rods that will help drain the fluid that comes in. And so they actually pack a clay over the top of that, which is what they've done here. So you can see on the inside, you have your sculpture, your layer of clay over the top of that, and then even a layer of fine sand. And then so they heat it up and then drain out that wax. And so they have a hollow cavity in there now. And they can actually pour in the molten metal. And then here's the finished cast here. So we will talk about Charles Ray's piece, Father Figure, from 2007. It's painted steel. It's quite large. It's basically life size. And he based it on one of those green plastic toy tractors, which he enlarged to life size in a plaster model before casting it in solid steel. And it weighs more than 18 tons. And it does have that toy-like quality because of the color that they've painted it. Also, it's modeled from a toy originally, but even look at this wheel. I mean, that looks like a totally toy wheel. And the father figure is quite menacing, so he's kind of taking something that's kind of fun and making it maybe not as fun. And he is literally part of the tractor. You can see he's basically molded right to it. And it's kind of a play with scale. You could think of it as a play with scale because the artist is taking something that's typically quite small and you can fit in your hand and making it huge. So he's definitely playing around with proportion and scale there with this piece. So we can also talk about Duane Hansen. He actually casts actual people, and he uses silicone that he applies to the skin. And the models have to shave all of their body hair, and they're cast in segments. And like I said, using silicone rubber that is applied directly to the skin. And after the rubber coating hardens, Hansen actually cuts it away from the model and then fills it with either a polyester resin material or an auto body filler type material. And so we'll take a look at a piece that is called Man with Camera. So the artist actually paints on the skin tones and adds the human hair and then the clothing. And in this process that he uses, the mold is actually ruined in the removal, so there can only be one of each of these sculptures made. And these sculptures are very realistic, obviously, partially because he's making ordinary looking people in really ordinary clothing and posed in everyday poses, which helps to create that illusion of realism, that this is a real person that you're looking at. And then plus also just being cast from real life models really helps with that realistic quality of these cast sculptures. And they're kind of, if you were to see these somewhere, you might not even know that this wasn't an actual person. So it might kind of mess with you a little bit. So it's from 1991 and it's auto body filler, polychromed in oil, mixed media, accessories that he's added, and it's life size. So that's Duane Hansen, and he uses the casting methods. So next up, we'll talk about Rachel Whitered, her piece Untitled Hive 1. It's basically, she's an English artist, and she uses the casting technique to make her sculptures. And the materials she uses are newer materials, polyvinyl resin being one of them. That was not something that's been around historically. It's relatively new material. And she actually likes to take empty spaces and then fill them with this resin to create a solid form. So she did this with her piece Untitled Hive 1, and she actually filled a beekeeper's hive with a brown-orange resin and then took away the hive to leave behind this solid interior of the hive, of the beehive. So she's kind of revealing the interior of something that we would normally not be able to see with such clarity. And the color of the resin is also indicative of honey and kind of ties into the fact that this is a beehive. So carving is another common method for making sculpture. Carving away unwanted material from a form and a sculpture is called a subtractive process. So we've talked about additive processes, but this is a subtractive. Carving is subtractive. Michelangelo actually used this method. He's probably one of the most famous sculptors out there. And if we look at the surfaces of his unfinished Awakening slave, the marks left show the steps he took towards the increasingly refined cutting that is necessary with carving. So this piece is about midway through the carving process, and it's actually kind of neat to see it like this, because we get to see the raw material that he makes his sculpture from. And it almost looks like the slave is actually being released from the stone, is escaping from the stone. And maybe that's why they called it Awakening Slave. And this is one of a series of 4 figures later called slaves, and they all were abandoned in various stages of completion. Probably left behind in his studio potentially, and that's where these pieces came from, but there's 4 of them that are very similar, not quite finished, and they're all called slaves. Carving is definitely the hardest of the 3 basic sculptural methods that we're covering, and this is because it's a one-way process, and it provides little or no opportunity to actually correct error. So once you carve off that piece of stone, there's no way that you're going to be getting that back. So before beginning to even cut, the sculpture must visualize the finished form in every angle within the original block of material. So the types of stones that are used have different characteristics, and definitely those characteristics will greatly influence the kind of carving that can be done with them. So marble is definitely a common material used by European sculptors and is typically soft and workable enough that it can be cut with a chisel. And then the final process of carving from marble includes polishing with a light abrasive. And this actually can yield a really smooth and creamy surface that actually can be very much like human skin. So a lot of nudes done kind of a long time ago in Europe are done in marble because they can be polished down and look very much like realistic human skin. And marble has definitely been the preferred material for outdoor sculpture historically, but modern pollution actually makes it a lot less of a desirable material today, because it's very susceptible to pollution. But granite is another material that is not as sensitive to pollution. So it has kind of taken over recently in terms of popularity for outdoor monuments. So typically if you see an outdoor monument, it's probably going to be made out of granite. And granite is really hard, so carving detail is difficult. And sandstone and limestone are also used for carving, but they're sedimentary materials and they tend to erode a lot quicker than granite and marble. But they're soft like marble and can be polished to a glossy surface. Let me just take a look and make sure I have some time. Okay, I think I can cover the next piece without too much trouble. So we're going to talk about a Chinese piece, Western Han Dynasty 100 to 220 CE, made out of jade, a specific type of jade called nephrite, and it has a diameter of 7 inches, and they just call it disc. So you can see disc, China, jade, nephrite, 7 inches diameter. So the Chinese are fond of using a stone called jade. It's really hard to work with, which makes it and it's very, very hard and brittle as well. So it's hard to work with. And you can only grind it or use a file to form it. So you can't use a chisel or anything like that. You have to literally file away at it or grind away at it to get the form that you're looking for. So it's only suitable for small pieces such as jewelry. And this was actually found in a Chinese royal tomb. And it's a really rare type of jade called nephrite. And this stone was ground nearly 2,000 years ago using drills and quartz sand. in a highly time-consuming and labor-intensive process. And that's why this is so expensive. And the raised circles are called bosses, and they line up perfectly